So today we move beyond sweet and tangy. But grieve not, because I've got a treat in store. It's actually something that you've been waiting for since practically the beginning of the course. Behold, the chosen one, the messiah of all rice, Champa rice. So today we're going to talk about the swan song of pre-modern Chinese civilization, the Song Dynasty, or technically the Song Dynasty. Now, under the Tang, we saw Chinese civilization obtain sort of the pinnacle of military and political hegemony in East Asia. The Sung are going to be equally as powerful, but in different ways. But the lesson of the Sung actually goes to this guy. I hate this guy. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Let me tell you why I hate this guy. One, it makes it seem like historians are sort of like collective insurance salespeople, that you need to know the past so you don't screw up. And I don't know, like, I'm not in the insurance business, and I think that actually history is interesting and good to know for reasons beyond not screwing up. The other reason I dislike this guy is, like, yes, if you ignore the past, you might blunder into the same types of problems that people in the past have experienced, like, obviously. But there's also kind of an opposite problem, and that is that those who sometimes remember the past too well overcorrect. And what we're going to find out is that the Sung are very familiar with past dynasties. Their problem is that they study the problems of previous dynasties too well, overcorrect, and in many ways, this is their undoing. So after the fall of the Tang dynasty, things get a little confusing, unless, of course, you don't find all of this confusing. And if so, you should probably be teaching this course instead of me. So it's not really all that important that you note every single, like, successor kingdom and warlord state. That's kind of overkill. What you need to do, though, is just look at this and sort of appreciate just how complicated everything is. So you have yet another generation where China basically disintegrates, there is no central government to speak of, and everything is chaos. Yay, chaos. So by 960, there are three major states in China. Basically, you can kind of divide it between a northern state, a western state, and kind of a whatever is a left state / a southern state. So you've got the Liao Empire. The Liao Empire is the northern state. The dominant group within the Liao are called the Khitan, or yeah, that's probably close enough pronunciation. And actually, they're related to the Mongols. Now, the Liao Empire, though, occupy, I think, about 16 prefectures in the north. And these were considered prefectures that are core territory, at least to the Tang dynasty. So, any successor dynasty is going to want to get that territory back. Then you also have the Jijia Empire. This is to the west. And then finally, you have the Song Empire, which at first is divided between the northern Song, and later on there's a southern Song faction that we'll talk about. Eventually, the Song will unite most of China and become the dominant power. However, they don't quite obtain all the territory that the Tang did. That's one of the many differences between the Song and the Tang. Now, the first emperor of the Song is Taizu, who was originally a military commander named Zhao Kuanggin. Now, at first, Taizu is mostly concerned with the reconquest of basically the old Chinese Empire, trying to restore as much land that existed under Tang domination back in sort of the glory days. Unfortunately, the Sung dynasty was writing checks that its army just couldn't cash. He leads an expedition to the north, and basically gets pretty epically defeated by the Khitan kingdom called the Liao Empire. And in fact, they have to sign sort of a humiliating peace treaty where the Sung agree to basically provide tribute to the Liao to prevent them from raiding and attacking. This is considered a pretty critical event in the history of the Sung dynasty because at this point, especially going forward, the Sung are increasingly focused not on military conquest, but in sort of rejuvenating the territory they already have under their control. So the Sung were never as militarily powerful as the Tang. And this is not because of any inherent weakness within the Chinese state or the Sung dynasty. It's actually a deliberate choice on the part of emperors like Taizu. Taizu and his successors studied history and looked at sort of what made the Tang Empire, the Tang Dynasty, work and also what didn't work so well. And the conclusion was that under the Tang Dynasty, there were military leaders who just had far too much autonomy. Remember, there was that rebellion in 751, the An Lishan Rebellion, which is kind of considered the point where the Tang Dynasty basically starts collapsing. So the lesson that's learned is that you want to limit the power of both the military and the aristocracy and place almost all military power under the control of the emperor. Instead of having armies that are sort of raised by regional aristocrats and governors, the army is going to become a professional army almost exclusively under the control of the emperor. So the Tang had already kind of realized that there was a problem with military commanders and aristocrats having too much power. And remember, they basically decided to empower the bureaucracy as a way to sort of counterbalance the power of the aristocracy. So what the Sung do is they're like, give me more of that. And they increase the size and the power of the bureaucracy even more than what existed during the Tang Dynasty. And remember that during the Tang Dynasty, the bureaucracy was already fairly powerful. So you expand the examination system, and basically you bring people in. If they score, like basically you cut standards a little bit. You lower scores, essentially, open more positions, and so you have the creation of more scholars. You also have a system where the emperor could basically directly appoint scholars, irrespective of whether or not they take an exam. So increasingly, the bureaucracy is seen as basically the emperor's pet, something that helps the emperor directly rule the empire. Now, problem. More bureaucrats mean more salaries, and more salaries, of course, means more taxes to be able to afford all these bureaucrats. So the Sung emperors raise taxes, and lo and behold, what happens is that the peasants rebel. When you basically increase taxes on the poor so that middle class and wealthier people can enjoy, better lives, that's kind of a bad look. So the conclusion was, of course, that the Sung emperors need an expanded military to suppress all of these rebellions. The problem is that, well, the generals had been so sidelined that they had no military commanders left, no strong military leaders to basically put down these rebellions. And so the bureaucrats, the scholars, basically step in. Now, the scholars are generally fairly bright people. However, remember that the scholars are getting a Confucian education where they're studying literature, the fine arts, the humanities, instead of like warfare, which is in many ways like applied geometry. So lo and behold, well, it works about as well as you think it would, which is to say, not at all. So what we see with the Song is not that they don't learn from history. They very definitely learn from the mistakes of the Tang. However, they tragically overcorrect, and it leaves them critically weakened. So if the Sung military was kind of like a D plus or a C minus, its economy is an A plus. Under the Sung dynasty, China's economy becomes the envy of the world. You can maybe argue that at no point in its history is China as overpowered economically than it is in the Sung dynasty. That's arguable, but I think it probably bears out. So industry. That doesn't necessarily mean that China's undergoing an industrial revolution, but arguably all of the elements of industrialization are present, including a large urban population, navigable rivers, other forms of infrastructure, in lots of capital available to invest. The one thing that we don't really see, of course, is the steam engine. But other than that, you see a lot of the elements that would be necessary for, the Industrial Revolution in the 17 and 1800s in Great Britain. So a lot of the economy revolves around first paper making, or basically moving away from woodcuts, where basically people are sort of like writing by carving things into wood. And we're moving into book production. Books are printed addressing all manner of subjects, including art, politics, philosophy, of course, literature, and then, of course, you have things like warfare and strategy. These books were seen as so strategically important to the Song that there was a thought about actually banning the export of these books, specifically to the Liao Kingdom in the north, and apparently numerous edicts were promulgated trying to curtail the export of these books, which, by the way, suggests that if you have to, say the same thing over and over again, that it probably wasn't widely followed. Then, of course, we have traditional Chinese commodities like salt, tea, and ceramics. So China during this time period aggressively deforested in order to mine for both coal and smelt iron. During this time period, Chinese metallurgy, and specifically ironworking, was by far the most advanced in the world. They even developed special metallurgical techniques to purify iron of its carbon impurities, and it basically creates an early version of refined steel pre the Bessemer process. And, of course, by around the 900s, you have gunpowder, something that it was significant, of course, when it was first developed, but becomes even more significant later on when it's gradually weaponized. Gunpowder was at first developed by Taoist alchemists, but later on, the Song began to develop it into some primitive bombs by the 12th century, and by the 13th century, the Song are actually employing some early battlefield cannons. So during the reign of the Song, Kaifeng, the capital, was a center of commerce. It was sort of the center of the textile industry. This is where you could find medicinal drugs, apothecaries, shipyards, restaurants, hotels. In many respects, Kaifeng probably resembled a modern city quite a bit. But one of the bedrocks of the Song economy was, of course, the development of paper money, which, of course, allowed for the economy to grow very quickly. The issue with paper money in general throughout human history is that with the development of paper money, you don't need money denominated by things like precious metals, specie, whatever you want to call it. And the thing is, if your economy is based around precious metals, it tends to limit the extent to which you can extend things like credit, loans, that kind of thing. So it tends to make the economy more stable, but it also tends to lower economic growth. paper money tends to increase the amount of overall economic growth because there's literally more money sloshing around in the economy. The issue, of course, is that thing that we know all too well, inflation. And of course, the Sung economy suffers later on because they print far too much of the stuff, and that causes severe inflation. So the bedrock of the Sung economy was, other than, of course, paper money and commerce, was, of course, they were still an agrarian society. And the Sung population reached, or rather, the Chinese population under the Sung dynasty reached over 100 million people. That's basically twice the population of the Roman Empire at its height. And of course, with all of these, with all this population expansion, that's going to require an equal expansion in the agrarian economy to basically feed everybody. Fortunately, that happens. So the first thing that kind of makes the Sung agrarian economy so dynamic is that you get improved farm tools, partially because of the development of iron and steel. So in other words, instead of using metals like copper, or even like we talked about peasants using wood tools in Europe to basically plow the soil, they're now using iron and steel. Also, you have new fertilizers, water control, and most importantly, the holy champa rice. So the champa rice was actually brought in from Vietnam by emissaries as tribute to the Sung emperor. Today, rice is the staple crop of not only China, but much of the rest of East Asia. But that really wasn't the case until this point in time. So, for example, in the north, it was more common for people to grow millet, barley, wheat, those kinds of staple crops. And of course, they grew rice in the south, but it's not the rice that we would call champa rice. The champa rice from Vietnam is rice that grows very quickly, and it grows in terrain that was previously considered unsuitable for growing rice. So champa rice grows in about 60 days, which basically means each growing season you can have 2 crops of it, which basically means you're effectively doubling your yield of rice. So champa rice, probably more than anything else, allows the Sung to feed a population of over 100 million people and also have capacity left over to have a vibrant commercial economy. Now, no Chinese dynasty would be complete without everybody's favorite topic, Buddhism, Confucianism wars. Hooray! Said nobody. So remember, you had the Tang Dynasty that Order 66 a lot of the Buddhist monasteries and just the Buddhist religion in China in general. To a certain extent, the preference for Confucianism over Buddhism continues in the Sung Dynasty. The problem is that Buddhism and Taoism are still popular with individuals, especially, common people in China. And so there's a sense by many of the Confucian scholars, especially individuals like Xu Zhi, who is kind of considered like the dominant Neo-Confucian scholar, there's a sense that Confucianism needs to be reinvented or rebooted for another generation. And so Confucianism is sort of encouraged by the state, and the big push is for Confucianism to stress personal morality and especially education for a huge chunk of the population. And it focuses on the social aspects of Confucianism. It really emphasizes day-to-day conduct. So this means we have a reinforcement of the traditional Confucian hierarchy on class and age and gender, for example. And the argument that if you have a strong hierarchical system based around filial piety, this is going to ensure social harmony. But you still have the problem of Buddhism and Taoism being very, very attractive. And, those philosophies slash religions are still compelling to a lot of people. And so basically, Neo-Confucianists play the nativism card. They argue, once again, that these religions to a certain extent are foreign. Confucianism is authentically Chinese. And the other argument is that these religions slash philosophies are superstitious. And if you look at Taoism and if you look at Mahayana Buddhism, which of course includes Zen Buddhism, they are a little bit more mystical. They're very mystical compared to Confucianism. Some may call it superstitious, but of course, one person's superstition is another person's mysticism. It's based upon your particular perspective. The other criticism that Neo-Confucians leveled at Buddhist and Taoist is that basically these philosophies are really emphasize meditation and introspection. And remember that Confucianism is really about an individual's relationship with society, and the objective is for the individual to learn to harmonize with society, and therefore allowing society to harmonize with, the will of heaven, that sort of thing. And so if, basically the idea is that there's no I in team if you're Confucius, or if you're Confucian. So you continue to see Buddhism and Taoism criticized by the Confucians. So the Sung economy was dynamic and wealthy, but there were some problems. One problem was, of course, the fact that the Sung had to pay tribute to the Liao Empire. And of course, because the Sung had to pay tribute to the Liao Empire, this sort of encourages other nomads to try their luck with the Sung. Also, you had tons of bureaucrats with very little to do. In other words, you have an overcorrection. Now we've gone from having too few bureaucrats to run society to far too many. Also, I'm going to point out that I mentioned Max Weber the other day, the sociologist who studies bureaucracy. One of the things that Max Weber notes, of course, is that the first prerogative of any bureaucracy is to basically ensure the continued existence of the bureaucracy, which means that bureaucracies tend to become bloated and basically they grow larger over time. And so you basically see that in the late period of the Song dynasty. So Wang Anshi, was a Confucian scholar who tried to actually mix things up and change things, especially the dynasty's finances. So he supports agricultural expansion to kind of grow the overall economic base, but he also encourages the implementation of new taxes, especially taxes on his fellow Confucians. And apparently Confucians were all about harmonizing with the state unless they're actually, taxed for it. Apparently taxation is not harmonious. And there's a lot of pushback against Wang's sort of reform attempts. He also tries to change the education system or the educational philosophy in Confucianism. So Confucian education emphasizes sort of a humanities, liberal arts-based education, and it also encourages rote memorization of things like texts and that sort of thing. And of course, what we know today is that memory and, intelligence, memory and analytical abilities, there's a correlation between the two, but there are tons of people with strong memories that have pretty weak analytical abilities. And many people actually lean on their memories so that so they can make up for sort of their deficiencies in their ability to analyze information. So he tries to actually shift Confucianism away from that. The problem is that his power comes from the Emperor Shenzong. And when Shenzong dies, basically all of these reforms are reversed by conservative Neo-Confucians and the new emperor. geopolitically, the Sung sort of get off to a rocky start with, losing that battle to the Liao Empire, and things don't really get that much better. So again, when the Liao manage to defeat the Sung, it's like all of the Sung's neighbors smell blood in the water. So the Zhijia kingdom, which is to the west, they also smell blood in the water, and they start also sort of attacking the Song, and the Song have to pay them tribute. Then you have basically a Mongol group that attacks the Liao Empire and absorbs them. And not only does this Mongol group basically absorb them, they start attacking basically Sung holdings in the Chinese sort of central plains, like this area right here. So this Mongol group declares themselves the Jin Kingdom. So the Jin eventually actually take the Sung capital of Kaifeng, which was a devastating loss to the Sung. So the Sung actually retreat down into the south and set up a new capital at Hangzhou. Now, this would be devastating to almost any empire, but in some respects, you kind of have a dynamic that's not all that different from the Western versus the Eastern Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire is conquered, it really doesn't harm the Eastern Roman Empire overly much because the Eastern Roman Empire is more economically vibrant, better defended, etc. And a similar dynamic is in play in the South. 2/3 of China's population are in the South, and this is kind of the heyday of southern China, actually. Most of the Sung economy is based in the South. I'll also say that during this time period, the Silk Road is kind of abandoned, partially because you have all of these sort of military threats along the Silk Road, and the Sung just don't control it in the same way that the Han or the Tang dynasties control the Silk Road. So instead what happens is you see the growth of Indian Ocean trade, where Persian and Arabic traders are starting to arrive and bring goods into southern Chinese ports. And of course, that generates a ton of economic activity, and in some respects, you could kind of argue that it actually eclipses that of the Silk Road. So that is the Southern Sung Dynasty. That is sort of like, those are the fortunes of the Sung Dynasty in general. Even though the Sung sort of lose their total monopoly of China, all in all, they're not all that harmed by losing their capital. And so the Southern Sung basically prosper until a new group shows up, led by a warlord by the name of Genghis Khan. Till next time.